November 25th, or 1918, Abercorn. The German flag comes down for the last time in Africa. General Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck, undefeated in 4 years of war, surrenders his army of 3,000 men. His German officers stand beside their African soldiers. The Schutztruppe Askaris. They fought a war of ghosts, outnumbered 10-1 across 3 countries, but now their empire is gone. What happens to a soldier when his country disappears? Where does his loyalty go when the flag he fought for is packed away in a museum? How do you go home from a war you never lost, only to find you no longer have an army? The Schutztruppe was Germany's colonial force in East Africa, a small but brutally effective unit, led by the obsessive Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck. They waged a 4-year guerrilla campaign against a vast allied army of British, Belgian, and Portuguese troops. For 50 months, they tied down over 300,000 allied soldiers, costing the British Empire more than 10,000 lives and £75 million. They were never beaten in the field. They surrendered only after hearing from a captured British dispatch that the armistice had been signed in Europe 2 weeks earlier. The war was over. For the Askaris, another one was just beginning. The men who formed this strange army came from over 50 different ethnic groups. Some were from martial peoples like the Hehe and the Ngoni, who had been brutally suppressed by the Germans years earlier and now found military service the best path to status. Others were the sons of Sudanese mercenaries who had served previous masters. A few were volunteers, many were conscripts. Their German officers, a mix of Prussian aristocrats and professional soldiers, subjected them to a discipline of legendary harshness. But this discipline forged an unbreakable unit. They were trained in German tactics, learned to use German machine guns, and were organized into 22 field companies. The most capable among them could be promoted to the rank of Effendi, an African officer with authority over other Askaris. This small chance at prestige, combined with regular pay and a sense of elite status, cemented their loyalty. At the Battle of Tanga in November 1914, 1,400 Askaris and their German officers annihilated an invading British Indian force 8 times their size. This stunning victory set the tone for the entire campaign. For 4 years they marched, often barefoot, living off the land, carrying their own ammunition, and fighting a war of relentless movement. The surrender itself was precise, almost theatrical. On the banks of the Chambeshi River in what is now Zambia, Lettow-Vorbeck, stiff and formal in his worn tropical uniform, presented his force to the British General William Edwards. The numbers were meticulously recorded: 155 German officers and non-commissioned officers, 1,168 loyal Askaris, and around 3,000 porters and camp followers who had formed the army's logistical tail. The Askaris were ordered to stack their rifles, mostly captured British and Portuguese models, and their single remaining working field gun, a relic from a battle 2 years prior. Lettow-Vorbeck gave a short speech in Swahili. He thanked his soldiers for their loyalty and bravery. He promised them he would see to it that they received the pay they were owed. Then the separation began. The German officers were sent as prisoners of war to Dar es Salaam, then put on ships bound for a broken and defeated Germany. For the Askaris, the future was a holding pen. They were marched under British guard to a demobilization camp at Tabora, a key town in the interior of what would soon be British Tanganyika. It was the same town they had once defended for Germany. Now it was their prison. They were held there for months, interrogated by British intelligence officers who wanted to understand how this small force had held out for so long. The British gave each man a few shillings and a document of discharge before telling them to walk home. For some, home was hundreds of miles away, across a land ravaged by the very war they had fought. Fields were fallow, villages were empty, and the great influenza pandemic of 1918 was sweeping across the continent, killing more people than the war ever had. They walked back into a world that had been irrevocably changed. Back in Germany, Lettow-Vorbeck was received as a national hero, the only German general to have successfully invaded British territory and the only one to return with an undefeated army. He led a victory parade through Berlin in March 1919, marching under the Brandenburg Gate with his surviving officers. He was a symbol of German honor in a time of national humiliation, but his politics were rigid and reactionary. In 1920, he participated in the Kapp Putsch, a failed right-wing coup against the democratic Weimar government. When the coup collapsed after just 100 hours, Lettow-Vorbeck was summarily dismissed from the army he had served his whole life. Now a private citizen, politically radioactive, his promise to his African soldiers seemed impossible to keep. Yet he persisted. He used his fame and his network of conservative contacts to relentlessly lobby the government. He wrote letters, he gave speeches, he shamed ministers in public. For 7 years, He fought for his men from 6,000 miles away, a cashiered general fighting for soldiers of a colony that no longer existed. Then, in 1926, the impossible happened. The Weimar government, finally achieving a measure of stability, agreed to pay. It allocated a significant sum for the back pay of its former Askaris. A German official arrived in Dar es Salaam with heavy chests of silver Maria Theresa thalers. This created a new problem for the British colonial administrators now ruling Tanganyika. How could they verify who was a genuine Askari veteran? There were no records. Paybooks, service records, and identity documents had been lost or destroyed during 4 years of marching through the bush. Thousands of men came forward claiming to be veterans, hoping for a share of the silver. The British officials, led by the governor, Sir Donald Cameron, were stumped. The solution came from the Askaris themselves. In front of a British government building in Dar es Salaam, lines of old African men formed. They had no papers to show. Instead, when their name was called, they were handed a broomstick. A former German non-commissioned officer, now working with the administration, barked out commands from the Imperial German Army's drill manual. The old men, many in their 40s and 50s, snapped to attention. Their bodies remembered what their minds might have forgotten. They executed the complex rifle drills, präsentiert das Gewehr, Gewehr über, Gewehr ab, with a precision that had not faded in 8 years. They did it with broomsticks. There was no faking this. Their muscle memory was their service record. One by one, they proved their service and were paid their dues in silver coins minted in Vienna, each bearing the image of the Austrian Empress Maria Theresa. These coins were trusted in East Africa. Their silver content was pure. Unlike the worthless paper money of the German hyperinflation, the event became a legend, a bush bank, opened and closed by a memory of discipline. If you value documented post-war history like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Now back to the story. The payment created a divide. For the several thousand men who successfully claimed their money, life changed. They became men of status in their villages. A veteran named Mponda Omari used his pay to buy land near the town of Lindi. He built a house and became a respected farmer. His pension, though small, arrived regularly from a government in Berlin he had never seen. He was one of the lucky ones. Many Askaris, particularly those from remote interior regions like Ujiji or near Lake Nyassa, never heard about the payments in Dar es Salaam. They lived out their lives in poverty, their loyalty unrewarded. A man from the Ngoni tribe who had served for 3 years near Lake Victoria returned to his village in 1919 with nothing but a tattered uniform. He died in 1958. Having never received a single pfennig, others found a more direct path to continued employment. The British, who had spent years fighting the Askaris, respected their skill immensely. They actively recruited former Schutztruppe soldiers into their own colonial army, the King's African Rifles. An Askari who was an expert machine gunner under a German officer in 1917 could be found teaching the same skills to British recruits in 1927. They simply swapped one European uniform for another, the German grey for the British khaki. For them, soldiering was a profession, not an act of national loyalty. By 1930, it was estimated that up to 30% of the non-commissioned officers in the King's African Rifles in Tanganyika were former German Askaris. They brought with them German bugle calls and a Prussian stiffness that blended oddly with British military tradition. A hard core of veterans, however, clung to their old identity. They formed veterans associations, the largest of which was the Askari Bund. They would meet in towns like Tanga and Tabra, wearing their threadbare German uniforms and their Imperial German medals, the Iron Cross, awarded to a handful of them for extreme bravery. They held parades on the Kaiser's birthday every January 27th. They were a living museum of a dead empire, an awkward presence in a British colony. Their leader, a former sergeant major named Kasim Mtenzi, corresponded regularly with Lettow-Vorbeck in Germany. They sent him letters written in Swahili, and he replied in German, the letters passing back and forth between two worlds that no longer officially connected. In 1933, the bond was co-opted. When the Nazi Party came to power in Germany, the memory of the Askaris became a useful propaganda tool. The Nazis wanted to reclaim Germany's lost colonies, and the unwavering loyalty of the Askaris was presented as proof of the supposed benevolence of German rule. The German Foreign Office located the records of the pensioners and, in 1936, announced that the pensions would be increased. Nazi propaganda films like Germanen and Karl Peters featured heroic portrayals of the Schutztruppe and their Askaris, often filming in Germany with black actors. The German government invited a few old veterans to Germany in 1938 for propaganda events. They were paraded in front of cameras, symbols of a colonial past the Nazis wanted to resurrect for a new, darker future. The most surreal moment came in early 1939. The German heavy cruiser Admiral Scheer made a goodwill visit to the port of Dar es Salaam. When the massive gray warship docked, it was met on the pier by several hundred Askari veterans. They were dressed in their old khaki uniforms, standing in neat rows. As the German officers came ashore, the old Askaris raised their arms in the stiff German military salute and shouted praise for Germany. They were saluting a warship that flew the swastika, the flag of a regime that considered them a subhuman race. The British authorities watched, deeply unnerved. The German sailors, many not even born when the African campaign was fought, greeted the old men, sharing cigarettes and stories. Just a few months later, on September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. The world was at war again. For the Askari veterans in Tanganyika, their loyalties now made them potential enemies of the state. The British security services monitored them closely. Some of the leaders of the Askari Bund were arrested and interned for the duration of the war. They were held in camps, one of which was located, with deep irony, at Tabora. They were now prisoners in the same place twice, once by the British as defeated soldiers, and now by the same British as suspected subversives. Their sons, however, were being recruited into the King's African Rifles to fight against Germany and Italy. Askari fathers who had fought for Germany in the First World War now had sons fighting for Britain in the Second World War, in places like Ethiopia, Madagascar, and the brutal jungles of Burma. The tangled legacies of empire played out across a single generation. One veteran, known only as Sergeant Kisabengo, was interned by the British from 1940 until 1944. His son was killed in action in 1943, fighting with the 11th East African Division against the Japanese in Asia. After Germany's second defeat in 1945, the pensions stopped. The country was divided, occupied, and in ruins. For nearly 2 decades, the surviving Askaris were forgotten. They were old men now, their stories fading into the background of a new Africa, a continent stirring with movements for independence. Tanganyika became independent from Britain on December 9th, 1961. The old soldiers were relics of not one, but 2 colonial masters. Their link to Germany seemed severed forever, but in the early 1960s, the story took one last turn. Journalists in West Germany wrote articles about the surviving veterans. The German public, grappling with its own fractured history, was reminded of this strange, lingering debt. In the West German parliament, the Bundestag in Bonn, a debate began. The motion was championed by politicians from the Social Democratic Party, who argued it was a debt of honor. On May 13, 1964, the parliament voted with overwhelming cross-party support to pay a final Irish one-time pension to every verifiable German Askari still alive. It was a gesture of historical conscience. The German embassy in Dar es Salaam was given the task of finding the men and distributing the funds. Once again, German officials faced the problem of verification. This time, they used old imperial pay records and photographs, cross-referencing them with the memories of the men who came forward. In 1964, on Timawais, a ceremony was held at the German embassy in the new nation of Tanzania. A few dozen very old men assembled. The West German ambassador, Herbert Schroeder, made a speech. He gave each veteran an envelope containing 2,000 Tanzanian shillings. They also received a certificate of thanks, signed by the German Minister of Defense. One of the men who received the payment was named Franz Tunda. He had enlisted in 1912. He had fought for 4 years. He had waited nearly 50 years for his final pay. Over the next decade, German officials traveled through Tanzania, seeking out the last survivors. They found a handful, living in remote villages, their stories known only to their families. The last confirmed pension payment was made in 1978, but the connection did not end there. In the 1980s, the West German government funded the construction of a small housing project in the Kijitunyama suburb of Dar es Salaam, specifically for the descendants of Askari veterans. The houses still stand today, a tangible brick-and-mortar legacy of this century-long relationship. In 1983, a German television crew filmed an interview with Anton Tanga, who claimed to be one of the last living Askaris. He was over 100 years old. He stood in his village, Ramadani, and recited the names of his German officers from 70 years earlier. He died 2 years later. The last known and verified Schutztruppe Askari, a man named Suleimani bin Ali, passed away in 1993. The German government had continued to send him a small pension until the day he died. It was the final payment on a debt from an empire that had vanished a lifetime ago. A promise made by a general in the African bush was kept, 65 years later, by a democracy he never knew.